Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. This is Shane with Then Shane Media. Today we're going to discuss Hellraiser from 1987. Let's get into it. Hellraiser is a 1987 film directed by Clive Barker, starring Doug Bradley, Ashley Lawrence, and Claire Higgins. Hellraiser tells the story of a man who solves a puzzle box known as the Lament configuration because he was seeking the extremities of pleasure and pain, but ends up unleashing a group of extra-dimensional demons known as the Cenobites, led by the Hell Priest, also known as Pinhead. Once taken, he is sentenced to an eternity of pain and torture. He manages to escape the Cenobites, but his body is decaying and completely mutilated. So he uses his brother's wife, played by Claire Higgins, who he also had an affair with in the living world, to help bring him sacrifices so he can feed and become whole again. However, his niece Kirsty, played by Ashley Lawrence, finds out what they're doing and makes a deal with the Cenobites to spare her and her family, like her father, mainly, and in exchange, she leads them to Frank so they can take him back. So essentially, we have two sets of antagonists in this film. Frank and Julia are our primary antagonist, and the Cenobites are a secondary antagonist, but clearly the more dangerous ones. So I've been studying the fact that John Carpenter's Halloween from 1978 was and is one of the most important horror films to me, and is definitely my favorite horror film of all time. Undisputed champion, hands down. But if I had to give the title of the number one most important horror film to me out of any one movie, I would have to give it to Hellraiser. It was the first horror movie I ever set my eyes on. I could have only been 5 or 6 at the time. I don't remember the exact age, but I remember watching it with my mom, and this was in the early 90s when if you were a kid, especially that age, watching horror movies, you felt like a big deal because at the time there weren't really very many parents letting their kids watch movies like that outside of like Goosebumps or Are You Afraid of the Dark or things along those lines. Kids just weren't watching horror movies. Times were just different back then, that's for sure. But because I had relaxed parents, I was watching horror movies from a young age, and it all started with Hellraiser. And because most of the other kids my age weren't watching these movies, I really felt like I was a big deal in my own mind, like it was this forbidden and sacred little thing that was my own little thing. It was this forbidden little thing that I had and no one else did. It was kind of a cool feeling. And not to mention, this movie just felt so intense to me. Like, as a kid watching it, it was like a roller coaster ride, a true exercise in intensity because of the subject matter and the use of practical effects especially. And even at that time, I would watch other horror movies after this, and they just all seemed so tame in comparison to this. And even now when I watch it, it still holds up. It's still a very intense movie, and there are some things that are dated about it, sure, but overall, I feel like this movie has aged pretty well, and it was mainly due to the use of practical effects. Which segues me into my first major positive of this film, the practical effects. What makes this movie stand out from the pack in my mind is the use of practical effects that hold up even to this day, with the exception of a couple scenes that were done digitally and they stand out like a sore thumb. CGI and digital effects honestly still haven't been perfected in Hollywood, but they sure as hell weren't perfected back in 1987. But there were even some practical scenes in this movie that I don't think aged very well, but fortunately those scenes are used pretty sparingly, and I would say 95% of this movie is practical and done very, very well. And the real standout work in this movie is what they did with the primary antagonist, Frank Cotton, or Uncle Frank, whatever you call him, right after he escapes from the Cenobites and he has no skin on him and he's just a bloody, exposed, and decaying skeleton, basically, with all of his nerve endings and everything on full display. And the way they utilize lighting anytime he's on screen just really creates an eerie and uncomfortable atmosphere in the best way possible. This was just done masterfully, and all the thanks to that goes to Bob Keane. He really did deserve an award for his work on this film. But another standout thing in this movie is the casting. As anyone knows, it doesn't matter how good the director is or the script if you don't have actors that can bring the characters and the overall plot to life. you have to have all three to make the magic happen, and this movie definitely has all three. Kirsty is actually in my top 2 favorite final girls, and I never really see her get mentioned or get the recognition I feel she deserves when people discuss the Mount Rushmore of final girls, but I honestly go back and forth between her and Sidney Prescott as to who is my favorite. Then, of course, we have Doug Bradley as Pinhead, aka the Hell Priest, and the only word I can use to describe that performance is epic. His entire look in this film is done to perfection and iconic, but even just his voice demands attention in this film. Pinhead and the rest of the Cenobites actually take a back seat through most of this movie, but their presence when they're on screen, like I said, demand attention, and it is utilized very well. Even to this day, when I watch this one scene in particular, it sends chills down my spine.
We'll tear your soul apart.
He really owned this role, and much like Robert Englund with Freddy, he has a very devoted fan base who refuse to be okay with another actor being Pinhead. And I mean, who can blame them? Me personally, I have never been the type of person who believes only one person can do a role. I don't care how good or iconic the role was, but I understand why some people, do feel that way, but there's always good talent out there that can bring honor and justice to any role, I believe, as long as they don't try to just copy and paste what their predecessor did and just bring the essence of that character while still making it their own. I believe another good actor could be Pinhead. In fact, it's one of the biggest and only positive things I had to say about the Hulu reimagining from this year was Jamie Clayton as the new Pinhead. Of the 4 actors that have portrayed Pinhead, she is easily the second best, and I feel like she did a pretty good job. Wasn't as good as Doug Bradley, of course, but still did very good, and I'm not the type of person who just crowns something as the best just because it was the original. I mean, Halloween 78 is my favorite horror film of all time and one of my favorite movies, but I still think James Jude Courtney did a better overall performance of Michael Myers, so I don't just use the term best lightly, but I digress. Claire Higgins and the rest of the cast also do a great job, by the way. I think the Cenobites are some of the greatest side villains and evil henchmen ever put to screen. In the hands of a lesser director, though, the Cenobites in this film probably could have came off as a little silly and campy and completely goofy, but because Clive Barker truly is a master of horror, that wasn't the case here. Anytime they were on screen, there was nothing silly or goofy about it. These things were pure evil. I mean, there is one Cenobite that teeters on being a little silly, and it's actually one of the only practical effects that doesn't age well. Cenobite is chasing Kirsty down a hallway or a tunnel, and I mean, especially nowadays with all the enhancements and high definitions, the flaws of this scene really stand out. But like I said, scenes like that are few and far between, so it's just a minor nitpick. So aside from a few dated and antiquated scenes that just simply don't age well, I really don't have a lot of complaints for this movie. As I said, just a couple of nitpicks. It's a solid movie and is one of the all-time greats, and Pinhead definitely deserves a spot on the Mount Rushmore of horror icons. Even though a lot of the sequels after 2 definitely really did his character badly, this movie alone cements his position as one of the greatest horror icons ever. So for a rating, I'm easily going to give this movie a solid 9. But that's it for this one, guys. Please like and share this video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. And if you'd like to hear my thoughts on any of the sequels, or if there's another franchise you'd like for me to discuss, I'm taking suggestions, so let me know down in the comments section, and I will catch you guys in the next one.